You are tuning in to Art of Citizenry podcast. I am your host, Manpreet Kaur Kalra. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, I want to welcome you. For those who have listened before, I'm excited to have you here with me again. Art of Citizenry is a community-supported podcast dedicated to decolonizing storytelling. This allows me to have unfiltered and nuanced conversations that challenge how power plays out in conversations around social, economic, climate, and geopolitical justice. We unpack history to really identify ways we can build a more equitable future. To support Art of Citizenry podcast, please give it 5 stars on your favorite listening app and be sure to subscribe. I want to start this episode with a trigger warning. We will be discussing sexual violence and rape, hate crimes and racism, and historical trauma. If you need to at any point pause, step away, or just stop listening, I understand. Unpacking generational pain can be incredibly difficult, which is why I believe it is important to create safe spaces for critical conversations, because it is these very unfiltered and raw conversations that allow us to deconstruct oppression and hate. Anti-Asian racism is systemic. From terrorizing the very Chinese immigrants who built America's infrastructure in the 1800s, to Japanese American incarceration during World War II, anti-Asian racism is baked into America's history. It continues to manifest through harmful imperialist narratives that further the dehumanization of Asian communities, perpetuating exploitative power structures in the form of white supremacy, giving validity to hate and violence. They are further through stereotypes that fuel microaggressions, exotification, and sexual violence. To understand the complex intersections of hate that influenced the horrific shooting in Atlanta, Georgia, that killed 8 individuals, 6 of whom were Asian women, we need to unpack white American imperialism and conservative Christian ideologies around sexuality.
You have to talk about the specific culture where this is coming from, which is white, patriarchal, misogynistic Christianity, fundamentalist, evangelical Christianity. We have to talk about that because that is where these boys are essentially being radicalized. And I know that's a really strong word, but that is what it is. They are being taught to perpetuate violence against women when they don't deal with their own internal issues.
That is the voice of Rachel Fowler, a co-creator of Tonle, a zero-waste, ethical, and sustainable fashion brand based in Cambodia. Together, we have been speaking extensively about the intersection of far-right Christianity, human trafficking, and fair trade. In fact, during the next podcast episode, we will dive deeper into that very conversation. White supremacy continues to terrorize anyone outside the bounds of whiteness. Hate, however, is further compounded by various forms of systemic oppression. Religious hegemony, white supremacy, and toxic masculinity are all deeply interconnected. Though to truly understand how this reality intersects with anti-Asian hate, we must first unpack white sexual imperialism. Imperialism is this notion of exerting force over another community, culture, or country to expand power and control.
You know, hearing that this man had gone and specifically targeted Asian women in massage parlors, before any comments were made, before any statements came out, I immediately, had made this connection because of my experiences working in Cambodia and seeing white evangelical Christian men target women working in massage parlors and spas, targeting them to actually procure their services as sex workers and targeting them to quote unquote rescue them, from these same perceived services. And the same men were part of the rescue complex and the procuring of sexual services and favors. And in many cases, the NGOs and nonprofits that were claiming to be doing anti-trafficking work were run by men who hadn't dealt with their own issues and biases and proclivities and were claiming to rescue and save women, but at the same time, even within the same organization, participating in that sexual exploitation. You know, having those experiences in Cambodia, my work in Cambodia is in running an equitable, sustainable fashion business. And yet there's a lot of overlap between the anti-trafficking world and fair trade. And so I saw firsthand the abuse that was happening within some of these shelters and the way that it was being portrayed, you know, internationally as these heroic white men and white women as well, going to Cambodia and rescuing these poor victims of trafficking. And at the same time, you know, some of these same men would say, well, as if she's a sex worker by choice or she's a voluntary prostitute, then I can pay her for sex and that's fine. A lot of sex workers experience extreme abuse at the hands of their clients. What matters is that all of these women are experiencing oppression and are being targeted because of racial stereotypes and sexist stereotypes.
In his book, Half the Sky, Nicholas Kristof writes extensively about his perception of human trafficking in the global South as a white man. His perception is what he perceives as reality, though as we know, these conversations are so much more nuanced. While we will be deconstructing this passage in so much more depth during the next podcast episode, I believe it is a critical perspective to keep in mind when peeling back the layers of white sexual imperialism. In his chapter titled Prohibition and Prostitution, Kristof writes, Western men do not play a central role in prostitution in most poor countries. True, American and European sex tourists are part of the problem in Thailand, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Belize, but they are still only a small percentage of the Johns. The vast majority are local men. Moreover, Western men usually go with girls who are more or less voluntary prostitutes because they want to take the girls back to their hotel rooms, while forced prostitutes are not normally allowed outside of the brothels. So this is not a case where we in the West have a responsibility to lead because we are the source of the problem. Rather, we single out the West because even though we are peripheral to the slavery, our action is necessary to overcome a horrific evil. From greenlighting white saviorism to vilifying non-white men, there's a lot of issues with this passage. For the sake of this episode, however, I want to draw your attention to how Kristof insists that Western men have played no role whatsoever in the sexual exploitation of women throughout Asia, disregarding a history of dehumanization, objectification, perpetuated by American imperialism that continues to exist today. To explore this further, Rachel and I are joined by Tara Teng.
I like to always introduce myself first before I introduce my work, because I think it's so important for us to see one another as people first, rather than just the work that we do. So my name is Tara Teng. My pronouns are she, her. I am a guest on the unceded traditional territories of the Kwantlen and Coast Salish Stolo people, now known as Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I am a biracial Asian woman. I'm a bisexual woman. I'm a demisexual, sapiosexual, polyamorous, Christian, divorced, single mama of two. I care deeply about people. My Cantonese name is Oi Kwan, and it means loves groups of people. It can also be translated as loves people groups or loves community, but the very core of my heart is people and caring about them. And through the intersections of my own personal lived experience that make up who I am as a person, I've always looked at the world since I was very young through this lens of, is it just? Is it fair? Is it equal do we see the human dignity of one another? Whose voice is missing from the table? And so that, if I can introduce myself in any way, that's the core of who I am. What I do is I work in the intersections of spirituality and sexuality. So I come to this work being raised in the evangelical church. I'm the daughter of a Southern Baptist pastor. And so I grew up, I came of age in the 90s, 2000s at the height of the purity culture movement in North America and all of the baggage that entails. I spent the last 10 years working to end gender-based violence and sexual exploitation throughout Southeast Asia, throughout Canada. I worked with survivors. I did undercover investigations for a short time. I worked in Parliament and was part of a team that amended the criminal code twice, wrote the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking. I wrote the Municipal Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking. We looked at this problem from many different standpoints. Now I work as an embodiment coach, taking everything that I've learned all throughout these years and realizing that every injustice that happens in the world starts with the body and the way that we see one another, or the lack of seeing one another in the fullness of our humanity. Everything, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all, go on down the line. Everything starts with the way we see one another and the lived experience of what it is like to live in our bodies. And so now I work as an embodiment coach, really working to help every one of us come back home to our bodies. And in order to be fully embodied, to live in the fullness of our humanity and come back home to our bodies, to listen to our bodies in a way that dispels shame that is often poured onto us by culture, by society, by purity culture, in a way that dispels shame, in a way that listens to our body, in a way that reclaims the fullness of who we are. And in order to do that, we have to talk about the barriers to embodiment. We have to talk about why so many of us don't feel safe at home in our bodies, which brings us right back to the conversation about justice and equality and fairness and whose voices are missing from the conversation, and how can we all reclaim the fullness of our humanity in the safety of our bodies.
As a society, we talk a lot about the ways in which the global South is still developing. But we fail to acknowledge the colonial exploitation that left these countries depleted of their richness. Narratives around human trafficking are dominated by a fixation on sex trafficking, which has become synonymous with Southeast Asia. From being stereotyped as sexually submissive to being portrayed as exotically erotic beings in pop culture, these racially charged stereotypes are rooted in colonial power structures that are deeply intertwined with conversations about sex trade.
We often see Southeast Asia as this hotbed of sexual exploitation. And in some cases, yes, like that's accurate. That's true. That does happen. But then we need to step back and say, why does that happen, right? Why are these countries broken? Maybe some of it has to do with US imperialism going in and fucking up their whole system. Maybe some of it has to do with the fact of the fetishization of Asian women. Maybe some of it has to do with the fact, like, who are the perpetrators here? Most of the time, I witnessed white men openly in the streets with their entitlement, possessively draping their arms over petite Asian women who are half their age and a third their size because they believed that they are entitled to this. They have the audacity to do that. So if anybody wants to actually be part of preventing somebody else's violence and exploitation and harm, I would love you to bring the men into the conversation. If somebody, especially from a North American context, cares about what's happening to women who are caught in sexual exploitation in places like Southeast Asia or South America or anywhere else in the world, because these white men are going everywhere else in the world because they think that they can. And what I heard a lot of the time was, oh, American women are too feminist now. They're too opinionated. So I go here because Asian women give me the respect that I deserve, because it plays into that submissive, eager to please servitude type. right? And these women don't have any choice to say no sometimes because of the power dynamics that are at play. So if you care about this and you want to see that change, I want you to look these white men in your community in the eye and say, stop. I want you to stand in between the victim and the oppressor and say, stop. I want you to call these white men, like, look, in the Atlanta shooting, the murderer, the shooter, the perpetrator was the son of a Southern Baptist pastor whose family was described as good Christian people. And the establishment that he decided to target and shoot up, that he admitted after the fact, the reason why he did this, he wanted to eliminate the temptation. And from my perspective, understanding both the Southern Baptist convention that he comes from, as well as purity culture, understanding that like the way that purity culture works is it puts you in this self-loathing shame cycle that he just wanted to stop. So he saw it more righteous to take out the temptation, to eliminate the source of his fetishization and his fantasies rather than dealing with his own internal problem. He saw it as more righteous to kill these women because they were the problem than have his own conversation with himself and realize maybe I need to have healthy sexual ethics here. And this is something that if you look at the Yelp reviews of the people who visited the establishment that he targeted, the same people in broad daylight with their name and their faces on Google had no problem leaving reviews that dehumanized and talked down about the bodies of the women who worked there. They had no problem leaving those reviews in broad daylight on the internet with their name and face attached to it, while also simultaneously leaving Yelp reviews for the church down the street and how fantastic it was to find Jesus at this church down the street. The same people are sitting in the pews who are then going and dehumanizing these women and then finding it as more righteous to go and kill them because they are having their own internal guilt. We need to have proper conversations about sex, about sexuality, about relationships. We need to get at the heart of this because what is coming out, because we haven't seen one another as human and we haven't had healthy ways to embrace our sexuality in a healthy and consensual way, it is coming out in a really ugly and deeply dangerous way that reeks of racism, misogyny, and white supremacy.
There is a stereotype that is being reinforced through a lot of the coverage circulating around the shooting. That stereotype being that massage parlors, particularly Asian-run massage parlors, are a front for sex workers.
No person deserves to be killed because somebody else has a repressed sexuality that they haven't dealt with. And no person deserves to be killed regardless of, what their job is or their situation. Like, it just does not matter, right? So I think the important thing is that the stereotypes of these women potentially being sex workers because of fetishizing Asian women, and, there's a stereotype of sex work being aligned with massage parlors in some cases, but not always. And the fact that there's that stereotype led to this man targeting these women, and that is tied to anti-Asian hate.
In an article published by the AP, Esther Cow, an organizer from New York City-based Red Canary Song, a group of Asian and Asian American sex workers and allies, stated, "The majority of massage parlors are licensed businesses that also provide professional, non-sexual massages. There is this assumption of sexuality and fetishization of Asian women's bodies that is unique to this kind of crime. To understand where this fetishization of Asian women stems from, we need to come to terms with America's racist history of imperialism."
We are one of the most fetishized people groups on the planet, right? That are seen as highly exotic, super feminine, eager to please, hypersexual, always ready to perform and please. This Orientalist trope that is grounded in racism and, again, dehumanization goes all the way back to the 1800s. Quite honestly, we see this, and it has a lot to do with imperialism. We see it play out in stories like Madame Butterfly, like Miss Saigon, We see it, so it has manifested into our pop culture, in our classical culture. It was heightened during, again, this is US imperialism, during the Vietnam War, and all of the different stations that are still active all across Asia, where American military bases still exist. And there is this fetishization of Asian women, and this white supremacy and entitlement of white men, quite frankly, around the world. And so how that manifests and how that has manifested for me is to be seen as this like little submissive China doll. That's how a lot of men have approached me. They've talked to me about, oh, I love Asian women. You're petite bodies and your tight pussies. And I know it sounds crude, because it is crude to talk about another person, to dehumanize them down to just their body parts. But this is the problem of fetishization, is that we are just all interchangeable body parts, because we're just seen as just these interchangeable Asian dolls to men who view us through that lens. That's the problem of fetishization, is that it's dehumanizing. And if you don't see my humanity because you view me as this fetishized fantasy, it is so much easier for you to perpetuate harm and violence upon me, because you don't actually see me as a person and as a human. That's why we're not having the consent conversation, because you don't even think that the consent conversation needs to be part of it, because you don't even see me as a human. And so this is, yes, it sounds very extreme, but especially, like, I've had these conversations my whole life with other Asian women, including biracial and mixed heritage Asian women. But especially in the last week, after what we saw happen and go down in Atlanta, all the Asian women and femmes that I have talked to have the same exact story. So yes, it sounds extreme and it sounds crude, but this is the way that our bodies have been talked about to our faces. And it is so deep-rooted in our history. This isn't something that just happened. Yes, anti-Asian sentiment, anti-Asian hate, and anti-Asian hate crimes has been up so much in the last year. Part of that is because of the COVID pandemic that we're dealing with. And when you have a president that calls it Kung Flu consistently again and again and again and again, that does something to people's psyches and then how they view us, right? And so when we're talking about Asian elders being attacked and killed and beaten in the streets, when we're talking about Asian women being targeted in a mass shooting, this is absolutely the intersections of racism, fetishization, misogyny, imperialism, purity culture. It is the intersections of all of these things that are deep rooted in our psyche, because they have been there for a very long time. And it is rooted in supremacy, it is rooted in dominance, it is rooted in power and control, it is rooted in the dehumanization of our bodies and of our humanity for the profit and gain of somebody else.
During the Philippine Revolution of the 1800s, the U.S. essentially established control over the Philippines as a result of the Spanish-American War. From living under Spanish rule to now American rule, Filipinos resisted and fought against American colonization for over a decade. This left hundreds of thousands dead, resulted in widespread famine and a complete depletion of resources. It also resulted in a booming sex industry catering to U.S. military men. We saw this same course play out during the Vietnam War, during which the U.S. military base was stationed in Thailand and housed tens of thousands of American GIs. It became a center for R&R, rest and recuperation or recreation, an actual component of U.S. military policy. R&R became synonymous with sex workers, nonetheless fueling a sex industry built on dehumanizing Asian women. In fact, Pattaya Beach in Thailand used to be a fishing town before the Vietnam War. Now it is one of the largest red light districts in the world.
My mom escaped from Vietnam due to the war, And a lot of Southeast Asian and Asian people in America were escaping wars. So American troops had a presence in these countries. And so if these soldiers are primarily interacting with Southeast Asian women in the context of sex work, and they don't have the opportunity to know or see Southeast Asian women in other contexts, it makes sense that these are the stories they came home with, and that this is all America has come to know of Asian women. It's really sad when you think about it. Like, stop and realize that you were in a war-torn country where people are suffering. People are doing whatever they can to survive. I know soldiers are traumatized for what they went through too, but to not be able to pause and understand that even these women who are sex workers, they're just doing whatever they can to survive. But no one ever humanizes them or tells that side of the story. And that just goes back to the issue with representation. For me in particular in Hollywood, because I teach film studies. But I mean, who's in control of publishing books, short stories, articles? The American narrative has been dominated by white men for far too long. It makes sense that they're telling stories of mail-order brides and Asian prostitutes.
Sex work is common around military bases. However, the issue with sex work in Southeast Asia is that it's colored by colonialism. When your whole understanding of a country is that it's less than or that it is inferior, you begin seeing the people of that country as less than or inferior. We see this in the global development space as well. In an earlier episode about mission trips, I explored how for some reason we believe a 14-year-old from America with no experience can build homes better than skilled labor in the global South. If we don't trust that 14-year-old to build our home, why do we trust them to build homes of communities rebuilding after suffering from years of colonial exploitation? It comes back to toxic white supremacy, cultural and religious hegemony, and in the case of Nicholas Kristof and those he represents, white saviorism.
It's the audacity of us to think that there isn't a single person equipped in that community or in that country to build a house better than our 14-year-olds can.
When Kristof says, Western men do not play a central role in prostitution in most poor countries, the vast majority are local men, he is failing to recognize that the problem he is trying to solve is in fact caused by a history of white male sexual imperialism. Failing to acknowledge this reality is deflecting accountability. Instead, he centers himself and the men and women of the West as saviors of all those being wronged by inferior beings, non-white men of the global South. The truth is, for all of us, our perceptions of reality are shaped by our internalized biases. Unless we make the conscious effort to set these biases aside, we end up seeing simply what we want to see, feeding into our preset understandings of cultures and communities.
The point is not what those women were doing. The point is that we have to look at the culture that's creating these stereotypes. Basically what happens is men and women, mostly white from evangelical backgrounds, they think that, because of stereotypes, that sex trafficking in Asia is like the worst possible thing to befall a woman. So they go overseas and they set up these organizations to free women from trafficking. And, you and I were reading a blog post of a woman who works in anti-trafficking and for a very problematic organization. And she describes her experience of going to Thailand and waking up in what she called a red light district and seeing young Thai women walking arm in arm down the street with white men. And she immediately assumes that she's in a red light district and that these women have been trafficked. And so she goes back to her room and she prays to God that she can be part of the story of freeing these women from sex trafficking. Now, I hope that people can read between the lines and understand that there's many, many things wrong. This is literally a person spends one night in Thailand. They think they know what they're looking at. Why do they think they know what they're looking at? Because of stereotypes. White women from the church have been essentially taught to believe that women have no ability to control their own bodies, no ability to make choices for themselves. And women in Asia are even more oppressed. And so they couldn't possibly choose, first of all, to work in sex work themselves. They couldn't make that choice because women can't make those choices for themselves. Secondly, the idea that sex work is as black and white as you're trafficked or you're a so-called voluntary prostitute. I can't get over that language. that there's this dichotomy between choosing and not choosing. It's just so absurd, right? Because sex work is so complicated. There are so many forms of sex work. You know, there are women who will go to a bar to pick up men and hope that, you know, maybe one day they'll get married to someone who has a lot of money. Is that the same thing as sex work? Because there's women in the US who do that too. People can be sex workers by choice. People can also experience exploitation while they're being sex workers. People can start working in sex work by choice, but they're underage, so they can't technically consent. And then they become of consenting age. So then technically then are they a sex worker by choice? Like, choice is a continuum, right? And because we don't teach people about consent in the Christian context, we don't teach people properly about consent, and we don't actually even respect women's right to consent, because we don't respect their right to make their own choices. I'm talking about we as in like the white Christian context. How can you respect a person in Southeast Asia's ability to consent? So back to the blog post, you know, you have the well-meaning white woman who comes in, stays in Thailand for one night, goes home and prays that she's going to be part of the story of rescuing these women who she doesn't even know anything about. She's just made all of these blanket assumptions. So this is why stereotypes are really dangerous, because you have somebody who goes, decides they know from one night what's going on because of the stereotypes that are in their mind because of their upbringing. And then they go and start multiple organizations to rescue these women. One of those organizations ends up going on to actually abuse multiple women within their care in Thailand. And they're currently not being held accountable because of the funding and the money that's being funneled through Christian churches who are all invested in this narrative of saving and rescuing women, while at the same time, like, perpetuating their abuse and their trauma. People go into these contexts with their stereotypes in their mind, and what they think that they're seeing is more influenced by their own culture, by their own issues, by their own biases than what's actually in front of them. And so their convictions become even more ingrained because they're like, I was there, I saw it. And it's like, well, what did you see exactly? And it's the narrative that made you feel like you could save people, like you were in power. By disempowering others, you were able to make yourself feel more powerful. And I know that's going to be really hard for people to hear, but that's the truth. It's that narrative is more about you than it is about the person you think you're trying to help.
Fetishizing Asian women is racist. Blaming them by calling them temptations is misogyny. In Atlanta's murder spree, the predator cited eliminating temptation as his motive. He is also a member of a Southern Baptist church. Turning a blind eye to the deep-seated role of religious hegemony is oppression and allows for colonial power dynamics to continue permeating. For this man, faith shaped his understanding of sexuality, an understanding rooted in toxic masculinity and purity culture, arguing that this hate crime is isolated to any one aspect of hate is disregarding the layers of oppression that led to the murder of these women.
More than one thing can be true at the same time. I remind this to people all the time. More than one thing can be true at the same time. Yes, I absolutely think that a massive motivating factor for the Atlanta shooter is that the influence of purity culture, that he wanted to eliminate what he saw was his temptation rather than taking his own personal responsibility for that. We also at the same time have to talk about the fetishization of Asian women. Like, one of my friends mentioned this really, really perfectly the other day. They said, are you a category on Pornhub or are you privileged? Because that's a visual representation of fetishization. Are you a category on Pornhub or are you privileged? Or do we get to see you as a human? Or do you just fit into a category? Right? That's incredibly important. We have to talk about the fact that the shooter was the son of a Southern Baptist pastor. That is a very openly misogynistic subculture, subcommunity, where we see men as the head of the household, where we only have male leaders, that there is a long and twisted history of racism and subjugation of people who are of different racial ethnic groups, right? The Southern Baptist history defended slavery at one point in time. And so this is who we're talking about. And it wasn't really that long ago when we're really thinking about it. So all these pieces play a role that has now created this swirling intersection that left 8 people dead. And specifically Asian women lost their lives as a result of racism, misogyny, and purity culture. All of these three things are true at the same time.
Many organizations tracking hate crimes have coined misogyny as a gateway drug for extremism and hate. To understand this, especially in the context of this hate crime, we need to first understand the relationship between women and the church.
I personally grew up in a church context where I think there is a very oppressive view of women. And, we were, as young girls, starting from, I think, around 12 years old, we were told that basically simply by existing and going about our days, trying to just live, we were causing men to sin and be tempted into sin. Young boys who we were supposed to call our brothers. And so we were told things like, if your bra strap happens to fall like out of the side of your shirt and a man sees that and he has a sexual thought about you, basically it's your fault because you tempted him into sin. And this goes really deep as well, because in this same church, women are not allowed to preach. Women are not allowed to teach. You're allowed to stand up on stage and share your feelings and thoughts, but you're not allowed to say, this is the truth and you have to listen to me. So in a context where you're being told that by your very existence, you are constantly causing men who are uncontrollable without God to sin, at the same time, you're never allowed to speak your truth or say, like, this is what's true. You have to listen to those very same men who are telling you how you should be living your life and how you should be acting. It's very hard to understate how deeply that can affect somebody, especially a young woman, a young girl who's being taught these extremely harmful narratives about herself. But at the same time, you're also taught to fear, what's going on outside of the church by heightening those fears and by saying, well, you think it's bad in here. Actually, like, the people who are really out to get you are out there, people from other religions, people from other beliefs, people who are from different races or cultures. Those are the bad guys, and we're here to protect you. Being both abused and being told that your abuser is also your savior and your protector. It's basically like being in an abusive relationship where you don't feel safe and you literally aren't safe, but you also feel like you can't leave because it's probably going to be worse on the outside.
So what about women outside the church? It sounds like there is this understanding that if you're part of the church, you are supposedly protected. But if you're a woman outside the church, we essentially don't care about you?
Yes. I mean, I can give you a personal example. When I would go to church camps or church outings and we would go to the beach, and all of us girls in the church were forced to cover our whole bodies while swimming, but then you're looking around and you're like, but there's girls over there wearing the bikinis, and is me wearing like a full body suit really going to keep the men from not being so like supposedly tempted when there's girls right over there wearing bikinis, right? And the point is, it was like you said, is like, we care about protecting you supposedly from being sexually harassed or assaulted by the men in the church. But if this is really the case, of course, these men are supposedly going to be exposed to temptations all over the place. The notion that girls in the church are going to be protected, but we don't really care, what happens to these other girls. This is all based on some really fundamentally messed up notions. Point is, the problem is not the women, period, right? The problem is the men. If you're constantly talking to women and saying, don't do this, don't do that, because if something happens to you, then you probably did something to deserve it. Instead of talking to the boys and the men and saying, actually, like, it doesn't matter if a girl's in the church or not in the church, like, this is how we treat women. This is how we talk about consent. And I think part of the problem is, I mean, the whole thing about kind of purity culture, it's about repression. It's like, instead of dealing with when you have these feelings and these urges, which are natural and normal, instead of dealing with how do you handle that in a healthy way, practicing consent and having like healthy conversations and dialogues, it's about repressing it. If you are a man who grew up in the church and you've constantly been told to like repress these desires because they're evil, you're going to be more likely to take that out on somebody outside of the church than you are somebody inside the church, because the church is not going to hold you accountable for that. You probably won't get caught. And it's even more easy to do it to somebody who's comes from a marginalized background, who can't go to the police, who might, for many other reasons, feel like they can't speak up or they don't have a support network. So are you going to be more likely to do that to somebody in the church? Or are you going to be more likely to do that to somebody who is outside of the realm of that supposed protection? And I also want to point out that, like, just even jumping through great hoops in order to be not sexually harassed and not sexually assaulted did not stop me from getting sexually assaulted or harassed by both men inside the church and outside the church. The point is that it's not about what women do, what profession they choose to work in, what clothing they wear. I mean, we know this, right? It's not about any of that. It's about the fact that we're not teaching men how to, and particularly in the church context, we're not teaching men and boys how to have healthy dialogue and consenting relationships. And, also teaching within this context that it's okay to judge and demean people who come from different religions or cultures or races. Layered on top of that, it's all very interconnected, as you've pointed out so many times.
Citing sex addiction as his motivation, the perpetrator of the Atlanta hate crime not only deflected blame, but also reminded many within the evangelical church of the great danger growing out of purity culture. So what exactly is purity culture?
All right, let's talk purity culture. So I'm going to give you a brief history as we're introducing purity culture of how I find that we came to be. Sometimes that's really helpful to step back and be like, how did we get here? It's a mess. So when I see purity culture came to its height. It's a movement that came to its height in the 90s, 2000s. And I see this as a response, as I said, the historical context. I see this as a response as we had the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, right? It was this breaking out of these traditional roles that we really saw. If we go even a couple steps backwards, we had after World War II, we saw this really strong push that was economic based. Do not make that mistake. It was economic based to push people really into these traditional values, these domestic values. We think of the 50s, we think of June Cleaver, and we think of these like wear your little apron and have dinner on the table by 5 p.m. And this was a systematic agenda in North America to push people into these traditional roles, to push people into the nuclear family and these very, very rigid gender norms. That became normative culture in North America. And then, so what we saw happening right after that is this breaking free of that, this resistance of that with the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, of free love, of advances in birth control medicine and accessibility, and all of these, really, really big reclamations of our sexuality and explorations of our sexuality that is then met with the AIDS crisis of the 80s and the 90s that is absolutely devastating. It was devastating. We lost, I'm a member of the queer community. We lost an entire generation of people in our community to this crisis. It's devastating. And after these two revolutionary time periods of the sexual revolution and the AIDS crisis, we then see this backlash with the birth of the purity culture movement of the 90s and the 2000s. This, that we have to return to these rigid gender norms and this rigid, this boxed in sexuality of the 50s that was economically driven to try to give men, as they were returning back from World War II, give them a place back in society, because women had stepped in on the home front. Women had stepped into jobs and roles and had kept things running. We needed to push women back into the home. And so we created this normative idea of what relationships looked like, about what gender norms looked like. And it was very economically and politically driven. And so we were trying to get back to that with purity culture in the 90s and 2000s. And purity culture became this idea that was imposed on, where we advocated abstinence-only sex education. This became normative. Purity culture really said that you ought to not have sex until you are married. And it really only looked at marriage, proper marriage, valid marriage, as between a man and a woman. Purity culture is inherently exclusive. It was very racist as well, too, because when we really peel back these ideas of purity culture and how it intersects with some of the other things that we're talking about as well, this isn't the first time that we needed to protect women's purity. We can go all back, and I'm going to give another trigger warning for what I'm about to say, because it is deeply disturbing. If we were to peel back in North America even further, and you look at the history of segregation, we look at the history of the Jim Crow laws, we look at the history of slavery in the United States, and what happened when we hypersexualized those who lived in Black male bodies, and we created the stereotype of the Black brute male. And we needed to protect white women's purity to the point that many men ended up being victims of lynching if they just looked at a white woman, because they might be threatening her purity. It's heavy. It's these heavy ideas that we need to protect people's purity. We don't often connect purity culture to something that is so devastating. And yet this is some of the dangers of purity culture, because it is this idea that we must protect your purity at all costs.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because I don't think I would have necessarily made that connection as someone who is new to understanding the nuances of purity culture. As a woman, can you talk a little bit about your experience growing up in purity culture?
We were taught, those of us in purity culture were taught, don't have sex before you're married. We were not given any access whatsoever to sex education, because there was this idea that you would then slide down the slippery slope if people started learning about their sexuality, if people started learning about even their own basic human anatomy, that then maybe they might end up having sex before they were married, and that it would just be absolutely devastating. So I remember growing up in purity culture and growing up in the church. This became a major cornerstone value in the evangelical church, and other denominations as well too, but definitely within the North American evangelical church. And so it became one of these things that I heard preached to me on Sunday mornings, in Bible study, when I went to camp. Like, it was like a main cornerstone of what was taught to me was, don't have sex before you're married. Your body can be a stumbling block for boys who just can't help themselves. They're just overcome with desire when they see your shoulder blade. They cannot control themselves, so you must cover up. And yet somehow simultaneously, the same people also believed in male headship, that men are the head of the home. Men are have the God-given authority to be the final word on all of the decisions that need to be made. And they are the best leaders of the home in every area except controlling and being accountable for the integrity of their own sexual desires, and whether or not they are consensually imposing those desires on someone else. And so because men just can't help themselves, the onus is really on those in women's bodies, in female bodies, to control and be modest so as not to lead these poor men astray. I was taught that my body was like a flower. And every time that I did something with someone else, if it was a man, if I did something with a man, because that was really the only context that they looked at, then I would be losing a petal every single time. And the day that I got to my wedding and stood before my was only presumed to be husband, I would then only have a stick left to give him if I had kissed or held hands or, God forbid, done anything more than kissing with any boys before I got to marriage. Then I would just be left with this stick, because we in purity culture watered down women's bodies and dehumanized women to objects. Which is wild, because one of the main teachings of purity culture was that we need to protect women's bodies because the world is going to treat them as sex objects. And then you just objectified us as only something that was going to give our future spouse pleasure one day. I literally remember being 12 and 13 years old and sitting in youth group and being taught that my body and my sexuality and my virginity was the number one most important, most beautiful gift that I could give my partner, my future husband. That was my most beautiful gift that I could give him, was my virginity. Not my mind, not my intellect, not my passion, not my compassion, not my desire to make a better world, not my desire to be his partner or her partner, to have their back, no matter what. No, the most important gift that I could give my future spouse was my virginity, full stop. It can go so much deeper than this, but this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about purity culture. And why is it dangerous? Because it's incredibly dehumanizing. That's one of the reasons why purity culture is so incredibly dangerous, is because the teachings of it, when you really dig down under the layers, are incredibly dehumanizing, because who you are in your sexuality, that is part of your humanity. That is part of who you are. That is part of your identity. So we were taught that unless it is within the context of a heterosexual marriage that is blessed by God, that it is a sin. I think it's really important to remind people that you're getting these ideas that are, quite honestly, a misinterpretation of scripture. I see the Bible verses that I saw people bringing forward to me to back up the purity culture ideas was that, look, see in the Bible, it says flee from sexual immorality. Now that I have spent decades studying biblical scholarship and theology and history and context, I understand that these verses, the Bible actually doesn't clearly define what sexual immorality is, quite honestly. It certainly doesn't say that it's not sex before marriage, because if anybody reads Song of Songs, you would know that that whole entire story is an erotic novel and the two main players are not married at all. They're not married. And in fact, there are so many other situations in the Bible in which God chooses to work through people, and the vehicle in which God uses is sex, and the players are not married. But what I do notice as I study this is sexual immorality. These Bible scriptures will list, it'll say sexual immorality. And if it does, there's a few places where it lists a few other things right after sexual immorality. So it says sexual immorality, and then it'll talk about incest, it'll talk about bestiality, it will talk about pedophilia, it'll talk about gang raping. That's what we're really talking about here. And when I look at all of these things, I look at what is the common thread here. The common thread is violation of consent.
Racism, compounded by heteronormative patriarchy and subjugation of women, creates harmful environments that breathe life into hate. How we see the world is deeply influenced by the narratives we are surrounded by. As explored further by Cara, these narratives have the power to shape our identities, and not just shape how we see others, but ourselves too.
For me, despite the reality I saw in my mother, my aunts, my cousins, and my friends, I was always aware of the fetishization of Asian women, though I don't think I fully understood that it was a thing and a damaging thing until college. And even then, and up until more recently, when I've been teaching film, where we talk about the male gaze and representation so much, I haven't fully understood where the fetishization of Asian women in America comes from or how it came to be, but I've always been aware of it. When I was in high school, where I grew up, I'd say it was a very colorblind school where we all were making and saying microaggressions all the time. And I see this working with high schoolers now as a teacher. When you're a teenager, you're trying to find yourself and figure out who you are. A lot of who you are can be told to you or placed on you by those around you. In my high school, I'd say the model minority myth ran rampant, and part of that meant the stereotype of, if you're Asian, you must be good at math, you must be good at school, you get straight A's in all honors classes. And I was partially that kind of Asian, the stereotypical one. Though I was embarrassed that I wasn't getting, and in fact struggling to get A's, sometimes even B's in those honors classes. But as a half Asian girl, I knew that my looks were viewed as exotic. I feel like my thought process of who I was at the time, or where I was trying to find confidence in myself, was in my looks, and completely owning this being exotic and looking exotic thing. My mom, a Vietnamese immigrant, she always used to tell me and my younger sister something along the lines of, your body is a diamond, you need to protect it. And it definitely sprouted from her fears of me being quote unquote ruined by boys. I never had a chance to have deeper conversations with her about any of that so that I could know where it came from for her. But this to me says part of this may have to do with patriarchy. My dad always tells me this story of how when he and my mom first started dating, she asked him if she could wear a sleeveless dress, like asked his permission. And his mind was blown that she thought she had to ask permission. So some part of her culture or her upbringing brought her to a place of not only serving men, but being subservient to them. What's scary to me is I don't know how much of my identity I created myself back then and how much was created for me. But I know so much of how I identified as a teenage girl was actually very closely with this idea of and image of an exotic looking yet somehow also pure Asian girl. If we couple that with the fact that I didn't realize or know this was a stereotype outright, even though I was loosely aware of the idea, I think it reveals how ingrained these stereotypes are and how much they're the accepted understanding of how others see us. And in the case of my teenage self, of how I saw myself.
That's the thing about stereotypes. They become so normalized, we begin seeing ourselves as the way society wants to see us. We also can't fully understand the nuance of anyone's reality unless we understand the context in which their identity has been shaped. Personally, when I first heard the news of the Atlanta shooting, I didn't realize how loaded the word temptation was and the layers of harmful narratives that influence this statement. That understanding is just so important because it helps us identify where the hate is stemming from.
So there's a Bible verse about ridding your mind of impure thoughts. And this has been interpreted as basically sexual thoughts. There's literally nothing in the Bible that says having a sexual thought is bad. It's not even in there, but this is how people have interpreted it. So, and there are a number of other very debatable passages in the Bible about virginity, about sexuality, about homosexuality, about other things, but there's lots and lots of different ways of interpreting them. So I'm not going to get into that, but I do want to highlight that this is a particular narrative that's been spun from a certain interpretation of certain biblical passages, which is by no means the whole Bible, or no one can say exactly what these passages mean. So anybody to say they have a stranglehold on the truth is fundamentally a problem. So purity culture is basically, a term that's been coined by people who kind of came out of evangelical culture and who are speaking up about how toxic this is. And it's pretty much, trying to get young girls and boys to basically not have any sexual thoughts or temptations that might lead them to have any kind of sexual interaction at all before marriage. So from, masturbation to kissing to anything, basically. And so you can imagine how absurd this is, right? Like when you tell a teenager, don't have sexual thoughts, like, what do you think they're going to do? Right. And so it leads to this pattern of self-hatred as well. Like if you're constantly being told like having a sexual thought is bad, and then you're going to be constantly having those sexual thoughts because it's normal and natural, and you can't actually even discuss it with anyone because everyone in your life will be like, you're a bad person and you're going to hell. And you're in this bubble where there's no safe space to talk about very normal and natural things that human beings do, then you're most likely going to have like a very deeply ingrained sense of self-hate And also, you're going to be, on one hand, having this internal self-hatred, but on the other hand, you do have, other men in the church who are telling you, well, it's not really your fault. It's probably those women who are walking around like tempting you. And so you also have someone to blame for your own internal self-hatred and for this unhealthy, toxic culture that you are growing up in. The way that it's presented as well is that these thoughts are separating you from God. And I think that that's like a really sick form of spiritual abuse, to be honest, because it's like telling somebody that something that's so fundamentally natural to human nature is going to keep them away from God. And the only thing they can do is go to the church, listen to the church leaders and pray about it and get help and confess. And that ultimately ties people more strongly to the religion, right? So it's really a tactic of control, in my opinion, to tell somebody that like this fundamental thing about you, which is so normal and natural, is like sick, evil, twisted. What you need is you need us and you need God and you need your leadership to tell you how to be better. So then you end up with people like this perpetrator who have such a deeply ingrained sense of self-hatred. They're also being told like, women are your, temptations, you're this, you're that. And you can easily blame them if you need an out. There's nobody speaking up in the church for the women because the church has been designed for women not be able to speak up for themselves. And then layered on top of that, you also have this thing of like, okay, these women who were presumably from a different culture and maybe a different religion, their temptations, they're Satan trying to tempt you. So it's okay in this worldview to go out and do violence against them because you're eliminating this temptation. And it's also, that's where like, I think the racism and the dehumanizing honestly comes in, where it's like, I wouldn't do that to girls in the church, but it's okay. Like, I don't know what was going through this man's mind, but I've heard, obviously not to that extreme, but I've heard conversations that I can see how people go there. I really can. And that's really scary. It's frustrating because I know there are women who came out of this context who have tried to speak up about it. But the problem is that because the way these churches are designed, they don't think they need to listen to people outside the church. And they definitely don't need to listen to women because women, this is the church context, is like, we are just emotional, irrational beings who just go with our whims. And we don't have like reason and rationale and truth and structure. And so we don't need to be listened to or believed. So you have this whole system that is set up for men to be able to not listen to women, to not believe women, to not trust women. I really think that women and men and the church need to deal with this in their communities because that's where a lot of this is stemming from.
Racism is a public health problem. It is a system rooted in colonialism, white supremacy, and patriarchy that oppresses many to the advantage of some. Until we break down these power structures, hate will continue to manifest and terrorize our existence. There is a lot of work to be done, but before we go into other communities and try to solve our understanding of their problems, it is important that we take the time to look inward and truly deconstruct the harmful narratives we have internalized within our own communities.
Identity, the human experience, discussions of racism, and discussions of oppression are messy and not clear-cut. It's all complex and nuanced. It's a never-ending journey. Try to see the individual, the human, the person you're interacting with in the moment of circumstances in which you're engaging with them or their story. We all want clear-cut lessons and takeaways, but sometimes we walk away with bits and pieces that only come together or become clear in different ways and at different times later on.
Over the last year, Stop AAPI Hate has documented over 3,800 incidents of hate against Asian Americans. Please visit stopaapihate.org to volunteer, donate, and access helpful resources. I want to thank you for listening. This episode was heavy. It was unfiltered and incredibly raw. I recognize some of the topics we discussed were deeply traumatizing and want to encourage everyone to please create space for both healing and joy. I also want to extend a special thank you to Rachel Fowler, Tara Teng, and Cara Shorey Choi for joining me and sharing their valuable insights. To learn more about our guests and connect with them, please be sure to check out the show notes. To learn more about Art of Citizenry and for information on future webinars and workshops, please visit artofcitizenry.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Manpreet Kaura. Please remember to subscribe to the Art of Citizenry podcast on your favorite listening app and give it 5 stars on iTunes. From here on Duwamish land, sending healthy and positive vibes your way.